The fading sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Goldfield, Arizona Territory. 1884. As Rachel Carter stood frozen at the post office window, her breath catching in her throat. The postmaster's sympathetic eyes told her what his words soon confirmed: her 12th letter to Yates Ingram had been returned unopened, just like all the others before it. The familiar package, tied with twine and marked "Return to Sender," sat like a brick in her trembling hands as tears threatened to spill onto her cheeks. 3 years of writing, hoping, and waiting had amounted to nothing but a stack of rejected letters and a heart that refused to heal. "I'm sorry, Miss Carter," Postmaster Willis said softly, his weathered face creasing with genuine concern. "Perhaps it's time to." The door to the post office swung open with a bang, cutting off his well-intended advice. A tall figure stood silhouetted against the bright afternoon light, dust swirling around his boots. Rachel barely glanced up, clutching her returned letter to her chest as if it might somehow protect her from further heartbreak. "Excuse me, madam," a deep voice drawled, the words wrapped in a gentle southern accent that made Rachel freeze. "I believe those letters were meant for me." Rachel turned slowly, disbelief warring with a dangerous spark of hope as she took in the sight of the man standing before her. Broad-shouldered and trail-worn, with a leather vest over a faded blue shirt and a Stetson pushed back on his head, revealing tousled dark hair streaked with dust from the trail. But it was his eyes, those unmistakable hazel eyes, that made her heart stutter to a halt. "Yates," she whispered, the name barely audible as it passed her lips for the first time in 3 years. He stepped forward, removing his hat in one fluid motion. "Rachel," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I read every single word you wrote, every single one." Rachel's confusion must have shown on her face, for Yates continued. "Not these," he gestured to the stack of unopened letters in her hands, "but the others, the ones you wrote before. I read them all over and over until the paper wore thin." The postmaster cleared his throat and discreetly stepped into the back room, leaving them alone in the small front office. "I don't understand," Rachel said, finding her voice at last. "My letters were returned unopened, all of them." Yates took another step toward her, close enough now that she could smell the leather and prairie dust on him, could see the fine lines that hadn't been there 3 years ago, etched around his eyes. "I never received them," he said simply. "I wasn't at the ranch. I've been." He paused, searching for words. "I've been trying to make myself worthy of coming back to you." Rachel's fingers tightened around the letters. 3 years, Yates, 3 years without a word. "I know." His voice was heavy with regret. "And I'll spend the next 30 explaining if you'll let me. But first," he reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper, worn at the creases from repeated handling. "This is the last letter you sent before I left. The one where you wrote about the stream behind your father's property, and how the wildflowers reminded you of the first time we met." Rachel's breath caught. She remembered writing those words by lamplight, pouring her heart onto the page. "You kept it all this time." "It's been with me every day since I rode out of Goldfield," Yates said, his eyes never leaving hers. "Through cattle drives in Texas, mining camps in Colorado, and a few places I'm not proud to have seen. But I'm back now, Rachel, if you'll hear me out." The packet of returned letters suddenly felt heavy in Rachel's hands. 3 years of unanswered questions stood between them, along with the hurt of abandonment that had never fully healed. But the man standing before her was real, not the ghost that had haunted her dreams, or the memory she'd struggled to keep alive. "Why did you leave?" The question that had burned inside her for 3 years finally escaped her lips. Yates glanced around the post office, then back to her. That's a longer story than ought to be told standing in a public building. Would you walk with me? Please. Rachel hesitated, torn between the caution born of heartbreak and the treacherous hope flickering to life within her. Finally, she nodded, tucking the returned letters into her handbag. Outside, the late afternoon sun bathed Goldfield's main street in golden light. The town had grown since Yates had left, with new storefronts and a proper hotel replacing some of the rougher establishments. They walked in silence past the general store, the saloon, and the blacksmiths, heading toward the edge of town where the buildings gave way to open country and the distant mountains stood purple against the horizon. "Your father's still at the same place?" Yates asked as they passed the last buildings of Goldfield. "Yes," Rachel replied, though he slowed down some. "My brother Elijah helps run things now." Yates nodded. "And your mother, still making the best apple pie in the territory and complaining about the dust." A small smile tugged at Rachel's lips despite herself. Some things don't change. They reached a fallen log at the edge of town, a spot where they had sat together countless times before Yates had disappeared from her life. By unspoken agreement, they both sat down, leaving a careful distance between them. "I left because I had to," Yates finally said, staring out at the horizon. "My father's debts were worse than anyone knew. When he died, men came looking for payment I couldn't make." Rachel turned to look at him, studying his profile. "You could have told me." "And what then?" Yates asked, meeting her gaze. "Ask you to wait while I scrape together enough money to pay off gamblers and loan sharks. Your father never thought I was good enough for you." "Finding out about my father's debts would have confirmed it." "That should have been my decision," Rachel said, a hint of the old anger flaring. "You're right," Yates admitted, "but I was 22 and stupid with pride. I thought I could make a fortune quickly and come back a man worthy of asking for your hand." He gave a bitter laugh. "Instead, I learned the hard way that fast money isn't always honest money and honest money isn't always fast." Rachel was quiet for a long moment. "So what changed?" "Why come back now?" Yates reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. He loosened the drawstring and tipped a few gold nuggets into his palm. "I finally struck a claim worth something in the mountains near Silver City, enough to pay off my father's debts with some left over." He closed his hand around the gold. "But somewhere along the way, I realized something more important than the gold." "What's that?" Rachel asked softly. "That I'd spent 3 years chasing something I thought would make me worthy of you, when all I really wanted was to come home. To you." Yates returned the gold to the pouch and pocketed it. "But when I rode back to the Ingram ranch, the place was abandoned. Nobody could tell me where you'd gone until I ran into old Sam Jenkins in Tucson last month. He told me your family had moved to Goldfield." Rachel nodded slowly. "After the drought 2 years ago, we couldn't make the ranch work anymore. My father heard about opportunities here. I rode as fast as I could," Yates continued, "but when I got to town yesterday, I heard you were being courted by the banker's son." Rachel felt a flush creep up her neck. "Douglas Reed has been persistent. Do you care for him?" Yates asked, his voice carefully neutral. "He's a fine man," Rachel answered diplomatically. Yates nodded, his jaw tightening. "I understand. I've been gone a long time." "I had no right to expect. I didn't say I cared for him," Rachel interrupted. "I said he was a fine man. There's a difference." Hope flickered in Yates's eyes, quickly tempered. "Even so, I've caused you enough pain. When I heard about the letters being returned, I had to explain." "I never received them, Rachel. I would have answered if I had." "Then who returned them?" Rachel asked, confusion evident in her voice. "That's what I aim to find out," Yates said, his expression hardening. "Someone at the ranch must have been sending them back after I left." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of 3 lost years between them. "Will you tell me about them?" Yates finally asked. "Your letters, what did they say?" Rachel looked down at her hands. "Everything. Nothing. At first I wrote asking where you'd gone, why you'd left without a word. Then I wrote about my days, my thoughts, things I wished I could tell you in person." She paused. "The last few. I guess I wrote those more for myself than with any real hope they'd reach you." Yates reached across the space between them, hesitating before gently covering her hand with his own. "I'm sorry, Rachel. Sorrier than I can say." The touch of his hand, warm and calloused, sent a jolt through Rachel that was both familiar and new. For 3 years she had tried to forget this feeling, to convince herself it had been nothing more than youthful infatuation. But sitting here now, with the setting sun painting the world in gold and Yates's hand on hers, she knew she had been lying to herself. "It's getting late," she said, reluctantly pulling her hand away and standing. "My family will be wondering where I am." Yates rose as well, settling his hat back on his head. "Of course, may I call on you tomorrow? There's still much I'd like to explain." Rachel hesitated, wary of opening her heart again so quickly. "I don't know, Yates, this is all very sudden." "Just an hour of your time," he pressed gently. "And then, if you want me to ride away again, I will." The thought of him leaving again made Rachel's heart constrict painfully. Despite everything, despite the hurt and the years between them, she wasn't ready to watch him go a second time. "1 hour," she agreed. "Come by the house at noon." Relief washed over Yates's face. "Thank you, I'll be there." They walked back toward town in silence, the space between them charged with unspoken words and memories. At the edge of town, where their paths would diverge, Yates stopped. "Rachel," he said, his voice low and earnest. "Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know something. Every mile I traveled, every night I spent under the stars, every time I thought I couldn't go on, I held onto the memory of you. You were my North Star, guiding me home." Before Rachel could respond, he tipped his hat and turned away, striding toward the livery stable where he had left his horse. She watched him go, his tall figure silhouetted against the last light of day, and felt something shift inside her, a door she had firmly closed beginning to creak open once more. The Carter home sat on the outskirts of Goldfield, a modest but well-kept dwelling with a small garden that Ruth Carter nurtured despite the challenging desert soil. As Rachel approached, she could see her mother through the window, setting the table for supper. She paused at the gate, gathering herself before facing her family's inevitable questions. The door opened before she reached it, and her mother stood in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. "You're late, Rachel." "We were starting to worry," Ruth said, her eyes narrowing as she took in her daughter's expression. "What's happened?" Rachel took a deep breath. "Yates Ingram is back in town." Her mother's hand flew to her throat. "Merciful heavens! That boy who broke your heart and disappeared without a trace." "The very same," Rachel said, moving past her mother into the house. "And he's coming here tomorrow at noon." Ruth followed her inside, closing the door behind them. "Does your father know about this?" "Not yet," Rachel replied, removing her bonnet and hanging it on the peg by the door. "Know about what?" Richard Carter's deep voice came from the doorway to his study. A tall man with graying hair and a neatly trimmed beard, he had the weathered look of someone who had spent his life working outdoors. Despite moving to town, he still kept a small herd of cattle on the land behind their house. "Yates Ingram is back," Ruth informed him, her tone making it clear what she thought of this development. "And apparently he's calling on Rachel tomorrow." Richard's bushy eyebrows drew together. "That young scoundrel who disappeared without a word, the one who left you crying for months. He had his reasons, Pa," Rachel said, surprising herself by defending Yates. "He wants to explain." "I'll just bet he does," Richard grumbled. Now that you've caught the eye of Douglas Reed, suddenly this drifter reappears. Rachel sighed. It's not like that, and Douglas Reed has caught his own eye, not mine. Her father harumphed but said nothing more as they moved to the dining table. Rachel's brother Elijah joined them, bringing with him the smell of leather and horses from his day's work. "What's got everyone looking so serious?" he asked as he took his seat. "Your sister's old beau is back in town," Ruth explained, passing him a plate of biscuits. Elijah paused mid-reach. "Yates Ingram, the one who—" "Yes, that one," Rachel interrupted, not wanting to hear the story of her heartbreak retold again. "He's come back and he has an explanation for why he left." "Well, this should be interesting," Elijah said, helping himself to the biscuits. "Want me to be cleaning my rifle when he comes calling tomorrow?" Despite her turmoil, Rachel smiled at her protective younger brother. "That won't be necessary. I can handle Yates Ingram. You always did have a soft spot for strays and lost causes," her father commented, not unkindly. "Just remember that some people don't change their nature, no matter how much we might wish they would." Rachel nodded, though she wasn't convinced Yates fell into that category. There had been something in his eyes today, a steadiness, a certainty that hadn't been there before. The reckless young man who had stolen her heart at 19 had grown into someone different. "All I've agreed to do is listen," she said. "1 hour of his explanation, and then I'll decide what happens next." Her parents exchanged a look, but said nothing more on the subject as they turned to their meal. Rachel ate mechanically, her mind replaying the afternoon's encounter. Every word, every look from Yates had stirred feelings she thought long buried, but could she trust those feelings after all this time? After supper, she excused herself to her room, drawing out the packet of returned letters from her handbag. 12 letters, each sealed with her hopes and dreams, each returned unread. Or so she had believed. Yates's claim that he had never received them raised a troubling question: who had sent them back? And why? She sat at her small writing desk, smoothing out a fresh sheet of paper. Perhaps writing would help her sort through her tumultuous thoughts, as it had so many times before. But as she dipped her pen in ink, she found herself paralyzed. For 3 years, she had written to a ghost, pouring out her heart to someone she believed would never read her words. Now that Yates was actually here, flesh and blood, and waiting for her response, what could she possibly say? The clock on her bedside table ticked steadily, marking the passage of time as Rachel stared at the blank page. Finally, she set down her pen without writing a single word. Tomorrow would come soon enough, and with it, the explanation she had waited 3 years to hear. Until then, sleep, if it would come, was her best refuge from the storm of emotions Yates's return had unleashed. But sleep proved elusive as Rachel tossed and turned, memories flooding back unbidden. The first time she had met Yates at a church social, his shy smile as he asked her to dance. Their rides across the open country, racing their horses under endless blue skies. The stolen kisses behind her father's barn, her heart pounding with the thrill of it. And then the morning she had awakened to find him gone, his ranch abandoned. No word of farewell or explanation. For months, she had waited for a letter, a message, some sign that he remembered her. When none came, she had taken matters into her own hands, writing the first of many letters that would ultimately be returned unopened. The hurt had eventually dulled to an ache, and life had continued. She had moved with her family to Goldfield, made new friends, and even entertained the attentions of Douglas Reed, though her heart had never been truly engaged. And now Yates was back, appending her carefully reconstructed life with 4 simple words. I read every single word. Dawn found Rachel at her window, watching the sky lighten over the distant mountains. She had made no decisions in the sleepless night, but one thing was clear: she needed to hear Yates out, if only to finally close the chapter of her life that he had occupied for so long. The morning passed in a haze of routine tasks and nervous anticipation. Rachel changed her dress 3 times before settling on a simple blue cotton that brought out her eyes. Her mother watched these preparations with a mixture of concern and resignation, offering only a gentle reminder to guard her heart. As noon approached, Rachel found herself on the front porch, ostensibly reading a book, but really watching the road for the first sign of Yates's arrival. Her father had made himself scarce, muttering something about checking on the cattle, while her mother busied herself indoors, though Rachel had no doubt she would find some excuse to assess Yates during his visit. Precisely at noon, a rider appeared on the road leading to their house. Yates sat tall in the saddle, his bay horse moving at an unhurried pace. He had cleaned up since yesterday. Rachel noted his shirt was fresh, his dark hair neatly combed, though still a bit too long. He had always disliked barbers, she remembered with a pang of familiarity. Rachel set aside her book and stood as Yates dismounted and tied his horse to the hitching post. He removed his hat as he approached, revealing a small nervousness in the way he ran his hand through his hair, a gesture so familiar that Rachel felt her resolve wavering. "Miss Carter," he said formally, stopping at the bottom of the porch steps. "Thank you for agreeing to see me." "Mr. Ingram," she replied, matching his formality. "Please come up and have a seat." Relief crossed his features as he climbed the steps and took the chair she indicated, setting his hat on his knee. Rachel sat across from him, smoothing her skirt and steeling herself for whatever was to come. "I've been thinking about what to say to you since I rode into town," Yates began, his gaze steady on hers. "I've practiced explanations and apologies 100 different ways, but now that I'm here, looking at you—" He shook his head. "Words seem inadequate." "Try anyway," Rachel said softly. "You owe me that much." Yates nodded. "You're right, I do." He took a deep breath. "When my father died, I discovered he had gambling debts I knew nothing about, bad debts to dangerous men. They came to the ranch the day after the funeral demanding payment. Why didn't you come to me?" "To my father?" Rachel asked. "He would have helped." "Your father never approved of me," Yates said without rancor. "He tolerated me because you cared for me, but he made it clear I wasn't the future he wanted for his daughter. And he was right. What did I have to offer you? A failing ranch, my father's debts, and a name that was quickly becoming mud in these parts." Rachel opened her mouth to protest, but Yates continued. "I was too proud to ask for help, too ashamed to admit I couldn't protect you from the mess my father had created, so I made a plan. I would go where the money was: the silver mines in Colorado. The cattle drives in Texas make enough to pay off the debts, and then come back to you, able to look your father in the eye as a man who could provide for his daughter." "That wasn't your decision to make alone," Rachel said, a hint of the old anger returning. "We could have faced it together." "I know that now," Yates admitted, "but at 22 I thought I was doing the right thing. I left a letter with Micah, our ranch hand, asking him to give it to you a week after I'd gone once I was too far to follow. The letter explained everything: where I was going, why I had to leave, and my promise to return." Rachel frowned. "I never received any letter." "I figured that out yesterday," Yates said grimly. "After I saw you, I rode out to what's left of the Ingram place. The main house is falling down, but the bunkhouse where Micah stayed is still standing. I found this hidden in a loose floorboard." He reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a yellowed envelope addressed to Rachel in his familiar handwriting. "Micah never delivered it," Yates continued. "And I'm guessing he's the one who returned your letters, too. He must have been collecting them from the post office." "But why would he do that?" Rachel asked, taking the old letter with trembling hands. "I've been asking myself the same question," Yates said. "Best I can figure, my father owed money to more people than I knew. Micah must have made a deal with them keep me away, let them take what they wanted from the ranch. If I'd gotten your letters, I might have come back too soon." Rachel stared at the unopened letter in her hands. "So you never knew I was writing to you?" "Not until I ran into Sam Jenkins in Tucson," Yates confirmed. "He mentioned in passing how you'd pined for me, writing all those letters that came back unopened. It was the first I'd heard of them." His expression darkened. "If I'd known, Rachel, wild horses couldn't have kept me away." Rachel carefully broke the seal on the old letter, unfolding it to reveal pages of Yates's bold handwriting. She would read it later in private, but the sight of it proof that he had not simply abandoned her without a word caused something tight in her chest to loosen. "3 years is a long time," she said quietly, folding the letter and placing it in her pocket. "People change." "Some things change," Yates agreed. "I'm not the same reckless boy who rode out of here thinking he could conquer the world. I've seen things, done things that aged me more than just the years." He leaned forward, his eyes earnest. "But some things don't change, Rachel. How I feel about you, that's as true today as it was then. Truer even, because now I understand what I stand to lose." Before Rachel could respond, the front door opened, and her mother appeared with a tray bearing a pitcher of lemonade and 2 glasses. "I thought you might be thirsty," Ruth said, setting the tray down on the small table between them. Her assessing gaze swept over Yates. "Mr. Ingram." "You're looking well, Mrs. Carter," Yates stood politely. "It's good to see you again, madam." "Is it?" Ruth asked, arching an eyebrow. "I would think you might prefer to avoid the family of the young woman whose heart you broke." "Mother," Rachel protested, but Yates held up a hand. "Mrs. Carter has every right to her feelings," he said. "I hurt Rachel deeply, even if it wasn't my intention. I can only hope to make amends if she'll allow it." Ruth's expression softened marginally at his sincerity. "Well, we shall see." She turned to Rachel. "Your father will be back soon for dinner. Mr. Ingram is welcome to join us if you wish." The invitation, however grudgingly extended, was unexpected. Rachel looked at Yates, who was watching her with carefully neutral expression, waiting for her cue. "I think that would be nice," Rachel said slowly. "Thank you, Mother." Ruth nodded and returned inside, leaving them alone once more. Yates let out a breath, relaxing slightly. "Your mother is as formidable as ever," he commented, a hint of a smile playing at his lips. "She's protective," Rachel said, pouring them each a glass of lemonade. "We all had to watch what your disappearance did to me." Yates accepted the glass but set it aside untouched, his expression growing serious again. "I never wanted to cause you pain, Rachel. You have to believe that." "I do," she admitted, "now that I understand what happened." "But Yates, it doesn't change the fact that we've been apart for 3 years. We're different people now." "Then let me get to know who you are now," he said simply. "And you can get to know me. We can start fresh." Rachel took a sip of her lemonade, considering his words. The prospect was both terrifying and exhilarating. "What about your father's debts? Are they settled?" Yates nodded. "Paid in full with interest. I made sure of it before I came looking for you. I didn't want any ghosts from the past following me." "And what will you do now?" "You can't go back to your ranch." "No," Yates agreed. "But I've saved enough from my claim to buy a new spread. There's good land opening up north of here." He hesitated. "Or I could look for something closer to Goldfield if I had a reason to stay." The implication hung in the air between them. Rachel felt a flush creeping up her neck but met his gaze steadily. "One step at a time, Yates. I'm not making any promises today." "Fair enough," he said, though she could see the hope in his eyes. "I've waited 3 years. I can be patient a little longer." The sound of approaching hoofbeats announced her father's return. Rachel saw Yates tense slightly, squaring his shoulders as if preparing for battle. "My father will have questions," she warned him. "I expect nothing less," Yates replied, "and I'll answer them truthfully." Richard Carter appeared around the side of the house, leading his horse. He stopped short when he saw Yates sitting on the porch with Rachel, his expression darkening. "Mr. Carter," Yates called, rising to his feet. "Good to see you, sir." Richard handed his horse's reins to Elijah, who had appeared behind him and approached the porch with measured steps. "Ingram," he acknowledged curtly, "I hear you've been gone a while." "Yes, sir," Yates replied, 3 years, and now you're back." It wasn't a question. "I am," Yates confirmed. "With your permission, I'd like to call on Rachel properly." Richard's bushy eyebrows shot up at the directness of the request. He looked at Rachel. "And what do you think about that, daughter?" Rachel met her father's gaze steadily. "I think I'd like to hear what Yates has to say, Pa. He's explained some things to me already that change how I understand what happened." Richard studied Yates for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable. Finally, he gave a short nod. "You'll join us for dinner, then? We can talk more inside." It was not exactly a warm welcome, but it was more than Rachel had expected. She caught the flicker of relief in Yates's eyes before he carefully schooled his features. "Thank you, sir. I appreciate the invitation." Richard grunted and headed inside, leaving Rachel and Yates alone once more. "That went better than I expected," Yates murmured. "Don't get too comfortable," Rachel warned him. "Dinner is when the real interrogation begins." Yates smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes and reminded Rachel forcefully of the young man she had fallen in love with. "I look forward to it." And despite herself, despite all the caution she had promised to maintain, Rachel found herself smiling back. Dinner was, as Rachel had predicted, something of an interrogation, though her mother's excellent cooking somewhat softened the atmosphere. Richard Carter questioned Yates extensively about his activities during the 3 years of his absence, his plans for the future, and his intentions toward Rachel. To his credit, Yates answered everything directly and honestly, even the questions that clearly made him uncomfortable. "So you spent 6 months working as a bouncer in a Denver saloon?" Richard asked, his disapproval evident. "I did," Yates admitted. "Not my proudest moment, but it paid more than ranch work, and I needed the money to settle my father's debts. And now these debts are paid. Yes, sir. Every last penny with interest." Richard nodded slowly, serving himself another helping of Ruth's roast beef. "And this claim you struck, it was legitimate, filed and registered with the territorial office," Yates confirmed. "I worked it myself for 8 months before selling it to a mining company last winter." Elijah, who had been mostly silent during the meal, spoke up. "Must have been a good claim if you could pay off your father's debts and still have enough left to think about buying land." Yates nodded. "I was fortunate. The vein ran deeper than anyone expected." "Lucky for you," Richard commented, his tone making it clear what he thought of fortunes won through luck rather than steady work. "I prefer to think of it as a blessing, sir," Yates replied evenly. "One that allowed me to make things right and come back here." Ruth, perhaps sensing the tension, changed the subject. "Rachel tells us you never received her letters, Mr. Ingram, that they were being returned by someone at your ranch." Yates's expression darkened. "Yes, madam. A man who worked for my father, Micah Tanner. He had his own reasons for wanting me to stay away, it seems." "And where is this Micah now?" Richard asked. "Gone," Yates said grimly. "According to the neighbors, he left about a year after I did, once he'd stripped the ranch of anything valuable." Rachel, who had been quietly observing the exchange, finally spoke. "Yates left me a letter explaining everything before he departed, Pa. Micah never delivered it. That's why I thought he had simply abandoned me." Richard's eyebrows rose. "Is that so?" "Yes, sir," Yates confirmed. "I found it hidden in the bunkhouse yesterday. I would never have left without explaining to Rachel, even if I felt I couldn't face her in person." Something in Richard's expression shifted, a barely perceptible softening. "Hum," was all he said. But Rachel knew her father well enough to recognize that Yates had gained a small measure of ground. As dinner concluded and Ruth served apple pie for dessert, the conversation turned to local matters: the growth of Goldfield, the news of a railroad spur line being considered, the dry season they were experiencing. Yates listened attentively, asking intelligent questions that revealed his genuine interest. "Where are you staying while in town, Mr. Ingram?" Ruth asked as she poured coffee. "At the Goldfield Hotel, madam," Yates replied. "Though I've been looking at a small cabin for rent on the north edge of town. I don't plan on moving on any time soon." His eyes met Rachel's as he said this, and she felt a flutter in her chest at the certainty in his gaze. He really did intend to stay. "Well," Richard said, setting down his coffee cup with finality, "it's been an illuminating evening, Ingram. I appreciate your candor." Yates recognized the dismissal and rose from his chair. "Thank you for your hospitality, Mr. and Mrs. Carter. Dinner was delicious." Rachel stood as well. "I'll walk you out." Her father opened his mouth as if to object, then closed it again at a look from her mother. "Don't be long," was all he said. Outside, the evening had cooled pleasantly, stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Yates retrieved his hat from the peg by the door but didn't immediately put it on, instead turning it in his hands as he faced Rachel. "Your family is exactly as I remembered," he said with a small smile. "Your father still terrifies me." Rachel laughed softly. "He's all bark." "I'm not so sure about that," Yates replied, but his eyes were warm. "Thank you for today, Rachel, for listening, for giving me a chance to explain." "I'm glad I did," she admitted. "I've carried the hurt of thinking you abandoned me for so long. It's freeing to know the truth." Yates took a step closer, close enough that she could smell the faint scent of leather and pine that she had always associated with him. "May I call on you again?" he asked, his voice low. "Perhaps take you for a ride on Sunday after church, if your father approves, of course." Rachel knew she should be cautious, should take more time to consider what Yates's return meant for her carefully reconstructed life. But the truth was, seeing him again, hearing his explanation, had awakened feelings she had never truly managed to bury. "I'd like that," she said softly. Yates's face broke into a smile that transformed him, erasing the lines of worry and making him look like the young man she had fallen in love with. Impulsively, he reached out and took her hand, his touch sending warmth spiraling up her arm. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I know I have much to prove to you and to your family, but I swear to you, Rachel, I'm here to stay this time." He raised her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles before releasing her. The gesture, old-fashioned and courtly, brought a blush to Rachel's cheeks. "Good night, Rachel," he said, settling his hat on his head. "Good night, Yates," she replied, watching as he untied his horse and swung into the saddle with the easy grace she remembered. He tipped his hat to her one last time before turning his mount and riding away, his figure silhouetted against the purple twilight. Rachel remained on the porch until he disappeared from view, her hand still tingling where his lips had touched it, her heart lighter than it had been in 3 long years. Inside, her family was waiting, their expressions varying from concern, her mother, to skepticism, her father, to amusement, Elijah. "Well," her father asked bluntly, "what do you make of his story?" Rachel touched the pocket where Yates's letter rested. "I believe him, Pa." The letter he found matches what he told me. He never meant to abandon me. Richard grunted noncommittally. Intentions aside, he still left you waiting for 3 years. He was trying to do the honorable thing, Rachel defended him, paying his father's debts before coming back to me. There's honor in facing your troubles together too, her mother observed quietly, in asking for help when you need it. He knows that now, Rachel said. He's learned from his mistakes. Her father studied her face for a long moment. You're going to give him another chance, aren't you? Rachel met his gaze steadily. I think he deserves that much. What about Douglas Reed? Elijah asked. He's been calling on you for months. Douglas knows I've never encouraged his attentions, Rachel replied. He's a good man, but he's not Yates Ingram, her mother finished for her. A knowing look in her eyes. Rachel nodded, unable to deny the truth of it. Despite everything, despite 3 years of separation and hurt, her heart had recognized Yates the moment she saw him in the post office doorway. It was as if a part of her that had been dormant suddenly sprang back to life, vibrant and undeniable. Just be careful, daughter, her father said gruffly. Guard your heart until you're sure of his constancy. I will, Pa, Rachel promised, though she wasn't entirely sure she still had the ability to guard her heart where Yates was concerned. It had always belonged to him, even when she had tried to convince herself otherwise. Later that night, alone in her room, Rachel finally read Yates's letter by lamplight. The pages were yellowed with age, but his handwriting was as familiar as her own, bold, slightly slanting to the right, with distinctive loops on his Y's and G's. My dearest Rachel, it began, and tears sprang to her eyes at the endearment. The letter detailed exactly what Yates had told her today: his father's debts, his plan to earn enough money to pay them off, his promise to return as soon as he could. The final paragraph, however, she read again and again, letting the words sink into her heart. I know what I'm asking is unfair, Yates had written. To wait for me with no certainty of when I'll return. I would understand if you chose not to. But know this, my Rachel, whether it takes 1 year or 10, I will come back to you. Every mile I travel takes me further from you in distance, but brings me closer to the day when I can return, worthy of asking for your hand. Until then, I carry you with me in my heart, where you have always belonged. Rachel carefully folded the letter and held it to her chest, tears flowing freely now. 3 years of doubt, of wondering if their love had meant anything to him, melted away as she read words that confirmed what she had always wanted to believe: that Yates had loved her truly, had never intended to abandon her, had always planned to return. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect Arizona day that made the hardships of desert living worthwhile. Rachel moved through her morning chores with an energy that had been missing for years, humming softly to herself as she helped her mother with breakfast and tended to the kitchen garden. You seem cheerful this morning, Ruth observed, watching her daughter carefully. Rachel smiled. It's a beautiful day. Her mother murmured, not fooled for a moment. Nothing to do with a certain visitor yesterday, I suppose. Rachel's cheeks warmed. Perhaps a little. Ruth wiped her hands on her apron and turned to face her daughter fully. Rachel, your father and I just want you to be happy. If Yates Ingram is the man to make you so, then we won't stand in your way. Her expression grew serious. But be sure, be very sure, a man who leaves once might do so again. He had his reasons, Mother, Rachel defended him, and he's back now. Yes, he is, Ruth agreed, and he seems sincere. But take your time, dear. There's no rush. Rachel nodded, though in truth her heart had already outpaced her mother's cautious advice. Reading Yates's letter last night had restored her faith in the love they had shared, a love that, she was beginning to believe, might still have a chance to flourish. The day passed in a flurry of normal activities, though Rachel found her thoughts constantly drifting to Yates. Would he really come calling on Sunday? What would people in town say when they saw them together? Douglas Reed would be hurt, she knew, though she had never given him reason to believe her feelings matched his. Her questions were answered sooner than expected when a knock came at the door that afternoon. Rachel, who was mending a shirt in the sitting room, looked up to see her mother answer the door. "Mr. Ingram," Ruth's voice carried clearly. "This is a surprise." Rachel set aside her mending and moved to the entryway. Yates stood in the doorway, hat in hand, looking slightly hesitant. "Mrs. Carter, Miss Carter," he greeted them. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all," Rachel said before her mother could respond. "Would you like to come in?" "Actually," Yates said, "I was wondering if you might accompany me on an errand in town. There's someone I'd like you to meet." Rachel glanced at her mother, who nodded slightly. "Let me get my bonnet." Minutes later, they were walking side by side down the road toward Goldfield's Main Street. Yates had left his horse tied at the Carter's hitching post, preferring to walk alongside Rachel. "Who are we meeting?" Rachel asked, curiosity getting the better of her. Yates smiled mysteriously. "You'll see. It's a surprise." They reached Main Street and turned toward the post office. As they approached, Rachel saw a gray-haired woman sitting on a bench outside, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her posture straight despite her advanced years. "Grandmother," Yates called, and the woman looked up, her face breaking into a smile that transformed her stern features. "There you are, my boy," she said, rising to her feet with surprising agility. "And this must be your Rachel." Rachel looked between them in confusion. "Your grandmother, but I thought that she died years ago," Yates finished for her. "That's what my father told everyone after their falling out, but she's been living in Santa Fe all this time." He turned to the older woman. "Grandmother, this is Rachel Carter. Rachel, my grandmother, Yates Ingram." "It's a pleasure to meet you, Miss Carter," Yates said, extending her hand. "I've heard so much about you over the years." Rachel took the offered hand, still trying to process this unexpected development. "The pleasure is mine, Mrs. Ingram. I'm afraid Yates never mentioned you." "My son made sure of that," Yates said, a shadow crossing her face. "He and I disagreed about many things, particularly his gambling. When I tried to intervene, he cut me off completely, told everyone I had passed away. I only found out the truth when I reached Santa Fe 2 years ago," Yates explained. "I was working my way through the territories, taking whatever jobs I could find. I happened to mention my name to the right person, and next thing I knew, I was being directed to my very much alive grandmother's door. The shock nearly killed us both," Yates said dryly. "But once we got past that, we had a lot of catching up to do. Grandmother helped me find honest work in Santa Fe," Yates continued. "And later, she was the one who staked me with the money to file my mining claim." Rachel looked at the older woman with new appreciation. "Then I owe you a debt of gratitude, Mrs. Ingram. If not for you, Yates might never have made it back to Goldfield." Yates' shrewd eyes assessed Rachel. "Oh, I think he would have found his way back to you eventually, but I'm glad I could help speed things along." She patted Yates's arm affectionately. "My grandson can be stubborn, but his heart is true." "Grandmother arrived on yesterday's stage," Yates explained to Rachel. "I wanted you to meet her right away." "Are you staying in Goldfield long?" Rachel asked the older woman. "That depends," Yates replied, her gaze moving between Rachel and Yates, "on how certain matters develop." Rachel felt herself blushing under the knowing look in the older woman's eyes. Yates cleared his throat. "Grandmother is staying at the hotel for now," he said. "But if all goes well with the property I'm looking at, she'll be joining me there. We've grown quite fond of each other's company these past 2 years." The affection between them was evident, and Rachel found herself warming to Yates Ingram. There was a directness about her that Rachel appreciated, and it was clear that she cared deeply for her grandson. "Mrs. Ingram, would you care to join us for supper tomorrow evening?" Rachel asked impulsively. "I'm sure my parents would love to meet you." "I would be delighted, my dear," Yates accepted with a smile. "And please call me Yates. Mrs. Ingram makes me feel every one of my 72 years. The three of them spent a pleasant hour walking around Goldfield, with Yates pointing out the changes since he had last been in the area, and Yates offering shrewd observations about the town's development. As they passed the general store, the door opened, and Douglas Reed emerged, stopping short when he saw Rachel on Yates's arm. "Miss Carter," he said stiffly, his gaze moving to Yates. "I was hoping to call on you this evening." Rachel felt a pang of guilt at the hurt evident in Douglas's eyes. "Mr. Reed, may I introduce Mr. Yates Ingram and his grandmother, Mrs. Yates Ingram. Yates is an old friend who has recently returned to the area." Douglas's expression tightened as he nodded to Yates and Yates. "Mr. Ingram, Mrs. Ingram, welcome to Goldfield." "Thank you," Yates replied evenly. "It's good to be back." An awkward silence fell, broken only when Yates spoke up. "Mr. Reed, is that your father's bank across the street? I'm in need of establishing an account while I'm in town." Douglas seemed grateful for the diversion. "Yes, madam. Reed and Sons Banking. We would be happy to assist you with your financial needs." "Excellent," Yates said. "Perhaps you would be kind enough to introduce me to your father now. Yates can see Miss Carter safely home." Before anyone could object, she had taken Douglas's arm and was steering him toward the bank, leaving Rachel and Yates alone on the boardwalk. "Your grandmother is quite formidable," Rachel observed, watching the older woman deftly managing the situation. Yates chuckled. "She's a force of nature." "I pity Douglas Reed right now." "She's giving us time alone," Rachel realized. "She is," Yates agreed, offering Rachel his arm once more. "Shall we make the most of it?" They walked slowly back toward the Carter home, neither in a hurry to end their time together. "Your grandmother seems to approve of me," Rachel commented. "She more than approves," Yates replied. "She's been encouraging me to find you ever since I told her about you in Santa Fe. Said any woman who would write so faithfully to a man who hadn't had the decency to answer was either a saint or a fool, and either way, I'd be a bigger fool to let you go." Rachel laughed. "I think I'm going to like your grandmother very much." "She'll like you too," Yates said confidently. "In fact, she already does, I can tell." They had reached the gate to the Carter property. Yates stopped, turning to face Rachel. "Thank you for today," he said quietly, "for meeting my grandmother, for walking with me, for giving me another chance." Rachel looked up at him, at the earnest expression in his hazel eyes, and felt the last of her doubts beginning to crumble. "Thank you for coming back," she replied softly. For a moment, she thought he might kiss her, and part of her hoped he would. But Yates merely took her hand and pressed it gently, respecting the boundaries of propriety. "Until tomorrow, Rachel," he said, releasing her hand reluctantly. "Until tomorrow," she echoed, watching as he collected his horse and mounted up. He tipped his hat to her before riding back toward town, where his grandmother would be waiting with her assessment of Douglas Reed and, no doubt, of Rachel herself. Inside, Rachel found her mother in the kitchen, preparing vegetables for dinner. "You're back sooner than I expected," Ruth commented. "Who was it that Mr. Ingram wanted you to meet?" "His grandmother," Rachel replied, taking a knife and joining her mother at the table. "Yates Ingram. Everyone thought she was dead, but she's been living in Santa Fe. She arrived yesterday." Ruth's eyebrows rose. "His grandmother. Well, that's unexpected. What is she like?" "Direct, intelligent, formidable," Rachel smiled, remembering Alina's deft handling of Douglas Reed. "I invited her to dinner tomorrow evening. I hope that's all right." "Of course," Ruth said. "I'm curious to meet her, and your father will want to form his own opinion of Yates's family." Rachel nodded, slicing carrots with practiced efficiency. "I think you'll like her, Mother. She has a certain, forthright quality. Rather like someone else I know," Ruth observed with a pointed look at her daughter. Rachel smiled but said nothing, her thoughts already turning to tomorrow and the opportunity to spend more time with Yates and to see how his grandmother fared with her own formidable parents. Dinner the following evening proved to be a lively affair. Yates Ingram arrived promptly at 6, escorted by Yates, who had clearly taken extra care with his appearance. Richard and Ruth Carter welcomed them with cautious warmth, while Elijah observed the proceedings with undisguised curiosity. Yates, it turned out, was a natural conversationalist with a gift for putting people at ease. Within minutes, she had Ruth discussing recipes and garden tips, while Richard found himself engaged in a surprisingly knowledgeable conversation about cattle breeding. "My late husband ran one of the largest spreads in New Mexico territory," Yates explained. "After he passed, I managed it myself for 15 years before selling to a younger cousin who had the energy for it." Richard's respect visibly increased at this information. "That's impressive, Mrs. Ingram. Not many women would take on such a responsibility." "Necessity is a powerful motivator, Mr. Carter," Yates replied with a smile. "And please call me Yates. We're practically family after all." The statement hung in the air for a moment, its implication clear. Rachel felt her cheeks warm as she caught Yates's eye across the table. He gave her a small, private smile that sent her heart racing. "That remains to be seen," Richard said gruffly, though without real hostility. "Of course," Yates agreed smoothly, "but one can hope." She turned to Rachel. "My grandson speaks very highly of you, my dear. From what I've seen so far, his judgment is excellent." "Thank you," Rachel replied, touched by the older woman's approval. "Yates has spoken highly of you as well since yesterday, at least, when I learned of your existence." Yates laughed, a rich, genuine sound. "Yes, we Ingrams seem to have a flair for dramatic reappearances, don't we? A family trait I hope doesn't continue to the next generation." The dinner continued pleasantly, with conversation flowing easily. By the time Ruth served her apple pie, it was clear that Yates had charmed the entire Carter family, even Richard, who had begun the evening with evident skepticism. "You mentioned yesterday that Yates is looking at property," Rachel said as they enjoyed their dessert. "Here in Goldfield." "Just north of town," Yates confirmed. "The old Sullivan place, about 100 acres with a small house and good water access. Needs some work, but the bones are solid." "Sullivan's been trying to sell that place for 2 years," Richard commented. "Land's not bad, but it's too small for serious ranching." "I'm thinking more along the lines of horse breeding," Yates explained. "Quality over quantity. I've got my eye on a Morgan stallion up near Prescott that would make a fine foundation for a breeding program." Richard nodded thoughtfully. "Morgans are good stock, versatile, smart." "That's my thinking," Yates agreed. "The demand for good saddle horses isn't going away anytime soon, especially with the territory growing like it is." Rachel listened to the exchange with interest. This was a side of Yates she hadn't seen before, thoughtful, strategic, with a clear vision for the future. The impetuous young man she had known seemed to have matured into someone more grounded, more purposeful. After dinner, while Ruth and Yates exchanged recipes in the kitchen and Richard and Elijah discussed the merits of different horse breeds, Yates drew Rachel aside onto the front porch. "Your grandmother is quite the diplomat," Rachel observed as they settled onto the porch swing. I think she's won over my entire family in a single evening." Yates chuckled. "She's been managing people her whole life. Says it's no different from herding cattle, you just have to know when to push and when to let them find their own way." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the swing moving gently beneath them. The evening was perfect cool without being cold, with a canopy of stars overhead and the scent of Ruth's roses drifting from the garden. "So," Rachel said finally, "horse breeding." Yates nodded, his expression earnest. "What do you think?" "I think it sounds like a solid plan," she replied honestly. "Better than chasing silver strikes or breaking up saloon fights." He grinned at that. "Considerably better for my health, too." "And you'd be staying in Goldfield," Rachel added, trying to keep her tone casual. "Putting down roots. That's the idea." Yates's voice softened as he looked at her. "I've done enough wandering, Rachel. It's time to build something lasting." The implication in his words was clear, and Rachel felt her heart quicken, but there was still one question that needed asking. "Why did you never write to me?" she asked quietly. "In all that time, you must have known I would be wondering what happened to you." Yates sighed, his expression somber. "I did write dozens of letters, but I never sent them." "Why not?" "At first, because I was ashamed," he admitted. "I had nothing to offer you but promises, and those seemed hollow even to me. Later, because I convinced myself it would be kinder to let you move on with your life rather than ask you to wait for a future that might never come." He shook his head. "I was a fool, Rachel, a prideful, stubborn fool." "Yes," she agreed, though gently. "You were." "But," Yates continued, "I kept every letter I wrote to you. They're in my trunk at the hotel. I'd like you to read them someday if you're willing." Rachel nodded. "I'd like that." Yates reached out slowly and took her hand, his touch sending warmth spiraling through her. "I know I have no right to ask after everything, but is there still a chance for us, Rachel? Could you ever trust me again?" Rachel looked into his eyes, seeing the vulnerability there, the hope, and the love that had never truly died despite 3 years of separation. "I think," she said carefully, "that trust can be rebuilt, with time and with proof that things have truly changed." Relief washed over Yates's features. "Time I can give you, and as for proof, I plan to spend every day showing you that I'm here to stay." He raised her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. The simple gesture held more emotion, more promise, than any flowery declaration could have conveyed. The sound of the front door opening caused them to move apart slightly as Alina emerged onto the porch. "Ah, there you are," she said, her shrewd eyes taking in their clasped hands. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all, grandmother," Yates replied, though he didn't release Rachel's hand. "We were just discussing my plans for the Sullivan property." "A fine piece of land," Alina commented. "With good potential, much like other things in Goldfield." Her meaningful glance between them made Rachel blush. "But it's getting late, and we should be heading back to town before your Rachel's father comes looking for you with his shotgun." Yates laughed, but rose obediently. "You're right, as usual." He turned to Rachel. "I'll call on you tomorrow. Perhaps we could ride out to look at the Sullivan place if you're interested." "I'd like that," Rachel replied, standing as well. As they said their goodbyes, Alina embraced Rachel warmly. "I'm so glad to finally meet the young woman who has occupied my grandson's thoughts these past years," she murmured. "I hope we'll become good friends, Rachel." "I'd like that very much," Rachel replied, finding she meant it sincerely. After they had gone, Rachel remained on the porch for a while, looking up at the stars and allowing herself, for the first time, to truly believe that Yates had returned for good, and that the future they had once dreamed of might still be possible. The days that followed fell into a pattern that quickly became the highlight of Rachel's life. Yates called on her daily, sometimes for planned outings, sometimes just to sit and talk on the porch swing. They rode out to the Sullivan property together, and Rachel could see why Yates had been drawn to it. The land had good pasture, a year-round creek, and a small but sturdy house nestled against a backdrop of rocky hills. "It needs work," Yates acknowledged as they walked through the empty rooms. "New roof, some repairs to the floors, fresh paint, but it's solid." Rachel ran her hand along a wooden mantelpiece, imagining the house as it could be: curtains at the windows, a fire in the hearth, the rooms filled with life and warmth. "It has good bones," she agreed, "and plenty of potential." Yates watched her move through the house, his expression softening. "What do you think? Could you see yourself here?" The question hung in the air between them, its significance unmistakable. Rachel met his gaze steadily. "I could," she admitted, "with the right person." Yates's smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. He crossed the room to her, taking both her hands in his. "Rachel," he began, his voice husky with emotion, but she placed a finger gently to his lips. "Not yet, Yates, we still have time," he nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Time," he agreed. "But know that when I buy this place, I'll be buying it with a future in mind. Our future, if you'll have me." The weeks that followed were filled with a joy Rachel had nearly forgotten was possible. Yates purchased the Sullivan property and began the work of transforming it into a home and a business. Rachel often rode out with him, sometimes bringing a picnic lunch, sometimes staying to help with the smaller renovation tasks. Eleanor, who had taken up residence in a small but comfortable room at the Goldfield Hotel, frequently joined them, her practical knowledge proving invaluable as they planned the layout for the stables and corrals. Word spread quickly in the small community that Yates Ingram had returned and was courting Rachel Carter in earnest. Most people were supportive, though Rachel occasionally caught whispers about "that man who broke her heart," or "the one who ran off." Douglas Reid maintained a polite distance, though the hurt in his eyes when they passed on the street gave Rachel pangs of guilt. "He'll find someone who truly loves him," Eleanor assured her one afternoon as they worked together, hanging curtains in what would become the parlor of the Sullivan house. "You did him a kindness by not encouraging his suit when your heart belonged elsewhere." Rachel sighed, climbing down from her stepladder. "I hope so. He's a good man." "Which is precisely why he deserves a woman who loves him completely," Eleanor pointed out, "not one who's settling because her true love is elsewhere." "You're very wise, Eleanor," Rachel said with a smile. "Not wise," the older woman corrected. "Just old enough to have seen how these things play out. Love isn't something to be trifled with or settled for. When it's real as it is between you and my grandson, it's worth fighting for." "Even after 3 years apart?" Rachel asked softly. "Especially then," Eleanor replied. "Time and distance are powerful tests. If love survives them, it's the genuine article." As summer turned to fall, the transformation of the Sullivan property continued. The house took on new life with fresh paint and repairs. While the barn was renovated to accommodate the horses Yates planned to acquire. He traveled briefly to Prescott and returned with the Morgan stallion. He had mentioned a magnificent bay named Valor with intelligent eyes and a proud bearing. "He's beautiful," Rachel breathed, watching the horse prance around his new corral. "He'll be the foundation of our breeding program," Yates said, slipping his arm around her waist as they leaned against the fence. The casual use of "our" wasn't lost on Rachel, and she found she didn't mind it at all. The day Yates officially moved from the hotel to the newly renovated house was marked by a small celebration. The Carters came out to the property, along with Eleanor and a few friends from town. Ruth brought a feast of fried chicken and biscuits, while Richard presented Yates with a handmade rocking chair for the porch, a gesture of approval that meant more than any words could have. As the afternoon waned and the guests began to depart, Yates drew Rachel aside to a quiet spot beneath an old cottonwood tree near the creek. "Walk with me," he asked, offering his arm. They strolled along the creek bank, the water gurgling peacefully beside them, the leaves of the cottonwoods rustling overhead in the gentle breeze. Yates seemed uncharacteristically nervous, which piqued Rachel's curiosity. "Is everything all right?" she asked when they had gone some distance from the house. Yates stopped, turning to face her. "Everything is better than all right," he said, taking both her hands in his. "These past months with you have been the happiest of my life, Rachel. Coming back to Goldfield to you was the best decision I ever made." Rachel's heart began to race as she recognized the gravity in his tone. "Mine too," she said softly. "I know we agreed to take our time," Yates continued, "and I've tried to be patient. But the truth is, Rachel, I've known since the day I rode into town and saw you standing in that post office that my feelings for you have never changed. If anything, they've grown stronger through our separation." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. Rachel's breath caught as he dropped to one knee before her, the golden afternoon light filtering through the leaves above them. "Rachel Carter," Yates said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. "I have loved you since we were hardly more than children. I loved you every day we were apart, and I will love you every day for the rest of our lives if you'll let me." He opened the box, revealing a delicate gold ring with a small but perfect diamond. "Will you marry me?" Tears welled in Rachel's eyes as she looked down at the man kneeling before her, the man who had left her. Yes, but who had also come back, who had read every word she'd written, who had proven his love and his constancy day after day since his return. "Yes," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Yes, Yates, I will marry you." The joy that blazed across his face was like nothing Rachel had ever seen. Yates slipped the ring onto her finger with trembling hands before rising to his feet and pulling her into his arms. His kiss was tender at first, then deepening with a passion that had been held in check for too long. Rachel wound her arms around his neck, returning his kiss with equal fervor, her heart so full it felt it might burst. When they finally broke apart, breathless and smiling, Yates pressed his forehead to hers. "I promise you, Rachel Carter, soon to be Ingram, I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret saying yes today." "I'm going to hold you to that," Rachel replied, her voice tremulous with happiness. Hand in hand, they walked back to the house, where Alina and the Carters were waiting. One look at their faces told the story before they could speak a word. "She said yes," Alina exclaimed, clapping her hands together in delight. Ruth hurried forward to embrace her daughter, tears in her eyes, while Richard shook Yates's hand firmly before surprising everyone by pulling him into a brief, gruff hug. "You take care of my girl," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Or you'll answer to me." "Yes, sir," Yates replied seriously. "I intend to do exactly that every day for the rest of my life." The wedding was set for Christmas Eve, a date that seemed appropriate for new beginnings. The entire town of Goldfield turned out for the occasion, the small church decorated with pine boughs and red ribbons, candles glowing in every window. Snow had fallen the night before, a rare occurrence in that part of Arizona, blanketing the town in white and adding to the magical feeling of the day. As Rachel stood at the back of the church on her father's arm, her heart full to bursting, she caught sight of Yates waiting for her at the altar. The look of love and wonder on his face as she began her walk down the aisle would stay with her for all her days. Afterward, at the reception held in the town hall, Eleanor found a moment to speak privately with the newly married couple. "I have something for you," she said, pressing an envelope into Rachel's hands. "A wedding gift of sorts." Rachel opened the envelope to find a deed inside the deed to the Sullivan property, now officially in both her and Yates's names. "Grandmother," Yates began, his voice thick with emotion, "I can't accept this. You've already done so much." Eleanor held up a hand to silence him. "You can and you will. That land should belong to both of you, as a symbol of the life you're building together." Her eyes twinkled. "Besides, I'm not getting any younger, and I'd like to see great-grandchildren running around that property before I go to my eternal rest." Rachel blushed deeply at this, while Yates laughed and embraced his grandmother. "Thank you," he said simply, "for everything." As the celebration continued around them, Rachel found a quiet moment to slip away to the cloakroom, needing a brief respite from the well-wishers and congratulations. She was standing there, fingering the simple gold band that now accompanied her engagement ring, when the door opened behind her. "There you are," Yates said softly, closing the door. "I wondered where you'd gone." "Just catching my breath," Rachel replied with a smile. "It's been quite a day." "The best day," Yates agreed, moving to stand before her. He took her hands in his expression growing serious. "I have something for you, a wedding gift." From inside his coat, he withdrew a package tied with string, a familiar package that made Rachel's breath catch. "My letters," she whispered, recognizing the bundle of returned correspondence. "But how did you—" "I went back to the old ranch one more time," Yates explained. "Searched through what was left of Micah's things in the bunkhouse. He'd kept them all, though why, I'll never know." He handed her the bundle. "I thought you might want them back. They're a part of our story, after all." Rachel took the package, tears welling in her eyes. "Thank you," she said softly, "but I don't need them anymore. Everything I wanted to tell you in these letters I can tell you in person now. Every day for the rest of our lives." Yates smiled, his eyes shining with emotion. "I like the sound of that, Mrs. Ingram." And as he drew her into his arms for a kiss, Rachel knew with absolute certainty that the long separation, the misunderstandings, and the heartache had all been worth it for this moment, this perfect moment of belonging, of coming home to the love that had waited, patient and enduring, through it all. In the years that followed, the Ingram ranch flourished. Yates's eye for good horseflesh proved as keen as he had hoped, and the Morgan stallion Valor sired offspring that became sought after throughout the territory. The house expanded along with their family, first with the birth of their son Richard, named for Rachel's father, and then twin daughters Eleanor and Ruth, who arrived 2 years later to much celebration. Eleanor Ingram, to her great delight, lived to see all 3 of her great-grandchildren. She passed peacefully in her sleep at the age of 82, having spent her final years in the small but comfortable cottage that Yates built for her on their property. One evening, nearly 10 years after their wedding, Rachel found Yates on the front porch, watching their children playing in the yard as the sun set behind the distant mountains. She settled beside him on the swing he had built, her head finding its familiar resting place on his shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, noting his contemplative expression. "How lucky I am," he replied, wrapping an arm around her. "How different things might have been if I hadn't had the courage to come back, or if you hadn't had the grace to listen." Rachel smiled, thinking of the long journey that had brought them to this moment of contentment. Everything worked out exactly as it was meant to. "It did," Yates agreed. He reached into his shirt pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper, worn thin at the creases, the last letter Rachel had written to him before he left, the one he had carried with him through their years apart. "I still have this, you know. I read it sometimes, to remind myself of what I almost lost." Rachel took the letter gently, recognizing her own youthful handwriting. The paper was so fragile now that she dared not unfold it, but she didn't need to. The words were etched in her memory as surely as they were in Yates's heart. "Love isn't just a feeling," she quoted softly from the letter. "It's a choice we make every day to see the best in each other, to forgive the worst, to believe in something larger than ourselves." "Wise words from someone so young," Yates commented, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I meant every word," Rachel said, "then and now." As the last light of day painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, their children's laughter filling the air around them, Rachel knew with absolute certainty that this moment, this life, this love was everything she had ever dreamed of and more. The long separation, the returned letters, the years of waiting, all of it had led here, to this perfect fulfillment of a promise made long ago and kept against all odds. And as Yates turned to kiss her, his love as steady and true as it had been on their wedding day, Rachel silently thanked God for the cowboy who had ridden back into her life that fateful day and said the words that had changed everything. "I read every single word.